Gosh, quick change behind the scene. I didn't have time to change my outfit, however. So we're going to stay in the spirit of trying to find concrete solutions, and we'll move seamlessly to our next panel, where we're going to discuss how finance and financial systems can tackle inequality and problems of exclusions. With me on stage, I have a group of panelists who've decided to call themselves the A-Team because their names all start with A. Anyway, I have Abigail Disney, furthest on my right, activist and filmmaker at Fork Films and Level Forward. Next to her, Cairns, Executive Vice Chair of Mastercard. I have Agnès Pannier-Runacher, Secretary of State for Economy and Finance here at Bercy in France. And next to me, I have Alessandra Perizzelli, who's the Deputy Governor at the Bank of Italy. Thank you all very much for joining us. So we addressed the issue of inequality, but it's worth remembering that global income inequality has actually fallen between countries over the past 3 decades. What is not working, however, is inequality within countries. It's partly a factor of globalization, but this is something that really needs to change. We're seeing the effects on women, on the poorest, and the people who are sliding down the social ladder. So what we're going to discuss is how financial markets and finance in general, which has been instrumental perhaps in causing some of the crises that have led to austerity or have just generated more wealth for the 1%, can actually be used and harnessed to reverse these effects and, be a force for good. So let me start just because you're closest to me, Alessandra, unfortunately for you. Why don't you start and we'll kick off, and this is a conversation, so please feel free to interrupt.
This is one issue that has been pretty much at the core of my activity as a member of the board of the central bank in Italy, looking at the way in which we can regulate the market, understand where banks are going, understand where operators are going in order to avoid polarization of positions and avoid also the lack of a financial education in the market. This has been an extremely important issue for us as we've seen the market developing towards a more technological offer of financial services and how that is going to have an impact on people who do not know less. It is clear that financial education and inclusion go hand in hand. And financial education is important because it allows us to exercise our rights to have credit, our rights to have a bankable position in life, our rights to buy houses, plan our family lives, our rights to get our children an education. All that goes through our ability to reach money, to reach finance, and to do it in the proper way. I'm a strong believer that technology is going to help the people who are polarized on one side of the world, those who are not bankable, those who are not able to reach credit and financial stability. In order to do that, though, as an authority that looks into the way the market is regulated, I think we need to have a hard look on how we educate our young people, and in particular our young women, to understand how the financial world works. So that would be my first take, and I'm with my co-speaker, I think we have a lot to say about this.
Absolutely. Agnès, would you like to go next?
Well, I will give one figure, which is striking, but give a good flavor of what's happening. In 2018, 2.2% of financing from capital risk were received by women. 2.2%. I mean, there is clearly room for improvement. Not to insist on that. And my belief is that the first step also would be for the people working in the financing market and the financing sector, and especially women, because it's not only a question of men and women when it goes to, you know, who is welcoming those projects led by women. And it's not only, obviously, capital risk. It might be any kind of project with banking, when banking support is needed. We need to, we should raise a question: do I have a bias when I say no to this woman? Why is it that when you consider a project led by a man, you will ask questions about what are the opportunities for growth, where do he see the additional potential customers, so all what is positive. And when you consider a project led by a woman, you will raise questions like, have you assessed the risks? What are the probability that you may fail? And this is something that is proven by academics. So clearly there is a bias in the way we address those projects, and we need to fight against that bias, to be very focused on that. And I think that will be a very good step to move forward.
I mean, I'd like you to answer the question I originally said, but also, do you think the sort of things Agnès is talking about, have you experienced it? Do you see it in your business? Not that you are doing, but that in the finance industry you've come across.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I think that the numbers speak for themselves. I mean, those biases exist. And I actually agree with Alessandro that you really, really need education. But if you connect people into the financial system and you don't educate them, then I think that's pretty dangerous. If you educate them and you don't connect them, then that's absolutely pointless. And I believe also that technology can be a great solver of this problem. Obviously, I sit in a technology industry, and one of the things that we've done is connect the 500 million excluded people into the financial system over the last 5 years. We committed to do it in 2015. We've just done it. And the thing is, many of those people are women. But going back to Agnès' point about the 2.2%, we've just done a survey in Mastercard around the world, 58 countries, where we've looked at what does it look like for women entrepreneurs? 165 million women entrepreneurs. And it doesn't matter if you're in America, or if you're in Ghana, or if you're in India. It's exactly the same results about access to finance. These women are not getting the capital, but worse, they're not even getting the funding to run their day-to-day businesses. And I think with the current political environment, where you have very polarized governments looking at popularist movements, it's up to businesses now to step in and help change this around the world. And businesses to collaborate with governments on partnerships and to work with each other. So, for example, we're working with Unilever in Africa, where we're digitizing the supply chain for thousands of shopkeepers across Africa, and we've already done it, and presented the data to banks, and on the basis of this data, got banks to lend money to 16,000 shopkeepers in Kenya. And you know, when we did that, the actual sales rose 20% in the first few months. Earlier, you were hearing from BMP in the UN Women about farmers. So many women are farmers in Africa, and we've reached out to 250,000 farmers now with a goal of 1 million, because many women farmers can't sell their products at market. They can't leave home. So they are actually selling them to middlemen who take a cut, and they're often men, middlemen, and giving those farmers access on their telephone, whether it's a smartphone or it's not, to sell their goods directly to market is what makes a difference to their lives. It's technology, it's education, it's connectivity, it's banks working with technology companies and with governments to change things. There's so much more we can do.
Great. Abigail, what do you think?
Well, I'm not a financial professional, and I can't speak to global issues, but I do know my country very well, the US. And we have two kinds of inequality, really, that we need to address differently, but equally aggressively. One is income inequality, and the other is wealth inequality. But both of those things started to really become problematic about 50 years ago. And two things happened in the United States. One was there was an aggressive push to change the nature of our tax structure. And the second was a movement among people in the financial world to change the understanding, the norms, and the practices at the highest levels in corporate America. And both of those things pushed such a dramatic change and shift in things that we're now looking at a middle class in the United States that really isn't living a middle class life anymore. Something like, now I can't remember, but I think it was 75% of Americans couldn't handle a $400 emergency if it came along. So we're actually right there at the emergency level. So two things I think are really important, and they have to be driven, I think, from the finance sector, because the finance sector drove the problem to begin with. And the first is that to re-understand and speak to people differently about the point and purpose of taxes. There's been a massive movement toward characterizing all government spending as a waste of money and bad for people. That's driving and underlying a lot of populist politics. And the fact that we have consistently characterized government spending as not as efficient as financial spending, not as meaningful, and not as likely to help the actual lived experience of human beings on the ground. We need to, first of all, stop selling that narrative from where we sit, and recognize that there are some things only governments can solve. So we need to take out of our vocabulary the language we use about how there's a market solution for every problem, or there's a win-win for every problem. The inequality we're looking at right now across the world is so extreme that we need to take win-win out of the equation. It simply won't occur that way. And then the second thing is the norms and practices of people at the high level in corporations. You know, Milton Friedman, almost exactly 50 years ago today, published an essay in the New York Times selling the idea of shareholder primacy. Shareholder primacy has taken hold so unanimously that some people think it's somewhere in the law. There's no law that says that the only duty of a CEO is to drive value to shareholders. When my grandfather ran the Walt Disney Company until 1971 when he died, he saw his job primarily as to look after the interests of everyone who worked for him. You know, a CEO is like the captain of the Titanic. He doesn't get off the Titanic with his $100 million until everyone else is seen to first. And so, you know, massive and ridiculous CEO pay is only one small piece of a larger puzzle. Things like only looking at numbers on a monthly and even weekly basis, driving short-term shareholder bumps to satisfy what financial markets are looking for in terms of performance. There's been an enormous shift in the way we think about how we should look at and understand business, and the financial sector has to drive that change, because no CEO can step out on a limb and do this without, at this point, getting punished for it.
You know, I recently joined the 30% Club as the global co-chair, and I couldn't agree more with what you're saying about taking into account the whole stakeholder situation. And I feel that the movement around the world to actually have more women join boards is something that is extremely positive, because I think it's moving us in a direction of good governance.
No, absolutely. There are several people on this panel who've done work on that, but let me try and involve the audience as well. So just to give you a little bit of context, last week on Thursday in the UK was Equal Pay Day. It's a huge misnomer. because, in fact, it's the last day of this year that women are paid to work. It's not that they stop working after that, they just don't get paid if you take the average gender pay gap. We'll carry on working till the 31st. Now, we've started touching on this, and the 30% Club works by sort of group social pressure and exertions and encouragement.
Well,
and
I
carrots.
like to say that, yes, encouragement and actually getting change through buy-in with the CEOs and the chairman. We actually got the men to convince the men, because they were mainly men, that it would be a good thing to have diversity at a board level. And I think that's quite sustainable because you're getting buy-in.
I'm going to ask the audience before we, so this is going to be a bit like a balloon debate. You're going to answer before and after again, so bear in mind, it'll show how open-minded you are, perhaps. Could I ask the audience, how many of you believe that we need quotas or changes in the law to make this happen? And if you could just put your hand up, roughly. Lights in my eyes. Great, okay, fantastic. We're going to have this conversation, and then we're going to ask if anybody's changed their minds. But so Anne's already touched on this. Alessandra, you've done work on this specifically, less carrot, more stick, but go for it. Tell us what you've seen.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to be clear, nobody likes quota. You know, you think that doesn't go together with merits and all of that. In Italy, we enacted a law on gender quotas about 6 years ago. And it was a painful process for all women association. We were like discussing, we were fighting at some point, saying, you know, forget it, why should we move on through privileged ways? You know, this is not a panda world, this is a world of merit, and we should be able to get ourselves up there without any quotas. I started that way, and I have to say I changed completely my mind about it, because I think that in certain societies, and I think that, you know, touches mainly, you know, all of Europe and outside of Europe, the idea, there is such an entrenched male culture when it comes to boards and when it comes to management, that I think we need a two-pronged approach. On the one side, I think the law helps you in getting in those women and make sure boards are familiar with the fact that there are women on an equal level that can be there, discuss, decide, and turn around companies, turn around banks, and make a decisive input into these big decisions. On the other side, I think there's a culture issue. And culture, you know, it is not changed by laws. It's changed by a number of other actions involving the private sector, involving universities, involving regulators. So I don't think you need one or the other. I think you do need both. And to go back to Italy, we went from around a 3% participation of women in boards to over 36%. So this has been a massive improvement. It took with it a change in culture in the boards, because the women who got there were very well prepared, they were extremely competent, slightly younger than the average age, and that had pushed headhunters to propose people, men as well, who are younger, who are more prepared, and who have a different approach to corporate world. So, in fact, it wasn't only a change bringing in the women, it was a catalyst to change everything. And that, I think, is what we want to go, because we want to do this together with men. You know, it's not a either or. It's a change of culture, but I think the push with the law was what was needed at the time.
Abigail, I think you wanted to jump in.
I think that culture is the bear, right? Quotas work. There's all kinds of science to support that quotas do work, and they've worked everywhere they've gone. And the point of a quota is to get you started. And that you should arrive at a place where you never have to refer to the rules, because there's no reason to think there aren't plenty of women who can fill those jobs, along with all the other marginalized groups, people of color, immigrants, and so forth. So a quota should be your first step, but it should become irrelevant at some point. And we know that there's no reason to not bring women onto boards, so why are they not there? There are more men named John in the Fortune 400, 500 than there are women CEOs. So this is, clearly not happening randomly or by accident.
I've changed my name to John.
Yeah.
We're all going to be called John from now on.
Yeah. Yeah. We also know, and there's science to prove it, that when women move into leadership in groups, they have more of an impact on the culture than they do as individuals. And generally speaking, when women rise into leadership, the first few pioneer women who get into leadership tend to be rather conservative and tend to sort of retrench the politics that keep women out. And so most of the science says they have to get there at about 30% before their behaviors start to affect the people around them. So it's important. And then, I work in culture. I'm trying to build a business in Hollywood right now. And part of the reason we started this business was that we believed a group of women should just go in and buy Harvey Weinstein's assets and own them as women and run them as women. And first of all, yes. The very process around how those assets were sold was so corrupted. And, there's an NDA, so I can't go any further into it than that. But let me just tell you, the worst of the Boys Club was involved in that, protecting those assets, specifically from women. So we started our own company. But I know for a fact that much of what Harvey Weinstein did at the Weinstein Company, he did on the basis of handshake deals for 9-figure amounts in informal settings, like golf courses and clubs and restaurants. And the thing is, culture makes culture makes culture makes culture. It's a circle. And if at the highest levels, the people making your culture are that fluent in the language of rape and aggression, then the culture that they make that then will continue remaking will always look like that. So it's important that women penetrate the highest levels, in part because we need to make culture differently. The process has to change. And none of that process will change until we change the capital structures. And the capital structures won't change unless we stop thinking in terms of handshake deals for hundreds of millions of dollars, which is, to me, that sounds like corruption. And so I think that it's partly in the financial sector where the capital is getting allocated, where there has to be some genuine rethinking about how it is that things get done.
Well, I understood that actually about 50% of the world's wealth is going to be in the hands of women over the next few years. And that's because inheritance, women's longevity, and so on is changing. And apparently 73% of wealthy women are unhappy with their financial advice and change their financial advisors within 12 months of actually inheriting. So I think some of the things that you're talking about could just naturally be changing demographically, but it's an interesting point.
I have a company I'd love them to invest in. Just let them know. Call me.
And yes, that resonates, these sort of handshake deals, that resonates very much with what you mentioned at the start about who's getting money allocated to them. But you're also in government. What do you think about law, quotas, and government getting involved in this sphere?
Well, I don't like quotas from a pure intellectual point of view because it seems that you will get something you don't deserve. But in fact, the question is not here. Facts and data is that quotas make the things change. You can see it in France at the level of the board. We now have reached a level of 44% of women in the board of directors, 44% within 8 years. Because we have taken a bill that say you cannot manage a company if you don't have 40%, more than 40% of each gender in the room of the decision. So clearly, we make it switch. And when you look at the governance as of today, I don't think that there is any problem with the level of competence at the level of the board. Another example is politics. We now have reached 48% of members of the parliament at the lowest chamber, Assemblée nationale. 48%. We deliver that performance because we have set quotas. There's no other reason why. So unfortunately, if we don't want to deliver any kind of gender parity within 200 years, then we will, my belief is that we will have to use this tool just to make the talents visible. Because what is behind quotas is that you make the talents, the female talents, visible. And then it's much easier to put them in executive position. Because as you have searched for talents, then, incredible, you have found them because they exist. So,
absolutely. I haven't got 200 years, and neither has even Clover's generation, who's much younger than me. But can I ask back to the audience then? You heard this debate on quotas. Can I ask anybody who, not the people who already believed in quotas, but who had their mind changed about quotas, who might think differently about quotas, if you could put your hands up? Okay, good job. Bravo. Bravo. We'll get there. Now, we've been talking a lot about what is different, what we're trying to do for gender equality, for marginalized groups generally. But where we started today was with a view from space. And at the end of the day, what unites all of us is far greater than what divides us. We had Jean-Laurent Bonnafé earlier. I'm not sure if he's in the audience, but he's a he-for-she champion. There are a lot of he-for-she champions. So how do we focus on overcoming differences and taking everybody with us? That's true inclusiveness in politics, not just in financial income equality terms. And stop politics, especially in this sphere, becoming as divided as it is in others. It's tribal when it comes to Brexit or Mr. Trump's policies. So perhaps I could just ask, maybe starting with Abigail, who has sort of living in the land of the free, to start with that. But we all have these experiences, and there is populism in every country that's surging up. How do we take everybody and have an inclusive debate about this?
The last film I worked on, with a far right-wing Christian evangelical on guns, and I challenged him on the question of, if you believe that every human life is sacred, how can you support the guns policy that you? And we traveled from church to church to church with the film that we made, just sort of not asking people to change their minds, but to actively entertain the thought that there might be a higher principle at work here that we could engage with. And what I know from that experience, because I made a lot of relationships in those churches, was you have to go and engage with people. You have to speak to people. You can't divide up physically. And in the United States, we buy our coffee in different places. We eat different chicken sandwiches. I mean, the way we divide ourselves up is quite terrible. And so it's going to have to happen place by place, individual by individual, sadly, and you wish you could do it at scale, but that's how it happens. And you can't go into those conversations and spaces with a plan for somebody to walk out of it with your idea, now in their head. That's not your job. Your job is just to engage. But more than that, gender is kind of the first difference. It's really the deepest of all the differences. And it stands to reason then that women need to carry with them, when they push for inclusive spaces, all the differences. There's more difference between two families of chimpanzees in the same forest than there are between one race and another in the world. The fact is, the great place to start is with the blue marble. Because from a distance, nothing that we think is real and that matters is actually real. So differences are, for the most part, imaginary. They are arbitrary. They mean nothing. And so you need to go back and look at the lines that separate countries that are the darkest ones on the map, and understand that they are imaginary lines and imaginary differences. And if you come to see those lines not as things that separate us from each other, but as things that maybe stitches that bind us together, then maybe there's a way to understand difference. We need to find a way to help, I'm sorry, I'm going to say it, white men, old white men, to learn to love change. Because change is the only reality. I mean, Ovid said it. I mean, it's not like this is a new idea. Change is the only thing you can count on and that never goes away. And if in your life you can learn to love it at every level, then everything gets a lot easier. I would love to live to see the day when I don't have to fight for this. I don't suspect I will. But if we as women go into these spaces insisting on diversity only as women, I think we fail. Because if we don't push to involve all the levels of diversity, I mean, I would love to see worker inclusions on boards. I would love to see quotas for immigrants, race, all kinds of different. I would love to see quotas for handicapped people. I would love to see one fat person on a board. Seriously. So it would be lovely if we could start the inclusion conversation always more inclusively.
Yeah. So, you know, my feeling about women is, well, it's not my feeling, we're basically half the human race. So we need to think of ourselves, we're not a minority that we're talking about here. And I don't know how many people in the audience read that book, Invisible Women. Yes. Did you read, anybody? Yeah? Well, this book sort of says that most of the world was built without women in mind and without women involved. And then it goes on to give like massive examples, crash dummies, microphones, all sorts of things. And even to a level where there's a tsunami and the men got together and built hundreds of houses and they forgot to build kitchens. I mean, when would that ever happen if you had a woman designer involved?
That would stop all problems about who gets to do the cooking.
They really actually think dinner just materializes out of thin air.
And absolutely. But I mean, I do think that a world that's designed better for women is actually better for everyone. That is the point. Because, you know, you can go from there and creating that gender inclusion, all of the things that you've mentioned, or, you know, people with disabilities, people of different nationalities, cultures, religions, they are all also women. And I think that starting with, let's really, design a world that includes women, that really changes the way that we're operating. There's so much data out there, isn't there, Alexandra? I don't know what the McKinsey figure now is. I think it's actually 28 trillion if women were actually economically empowered to the level of men. So I think the premise should be this benefits all of us.
I think you wanted to come in, Alessandra. Go for it.
I really want to, because I think we need to be very clear about power and where we get to positions of power, and that we normally shy away from it. We are sometimes afraid of taking that power in our hands, and lots of us are in position of powers now. So what do we do with that? I think that Madeleine Albright said that there was a special place in hell for women who do not help other women when they get there, and I believe in that, and I think that we have to, for our young women, when we get in those positions, devise processes, talent pools, ways to empower young women, educate them in everything, which is also the way in which you walk into a new job, and just make sure you got that pay equal to the guys who are being in university with you and they're getting for the same position, and not be afraid of saying these things. I think that there is a big, right now in Europe and everywhere in the world, it's a big point of interest, this kind of sovereignist, populist governments. These are bad for women, and I'm convinced about this. There's a big debate in Italy right now about this, and the fact that we need to educate women not to vote for those who are enemies of women in power, of young women, of, I see a setback in this last year that scares me. You know, I'm the mother of a 19-year-old girl. She's walking in the world right now. I ask myself what kind of work she's going to get every day, and I see a setback. And I think we need to be aware of this. We should not be shy about this and make our choices, our democratic choices, exercise our rights with full awareness of who's doing the best for us. You know, which party, which government, do we want this? And be vocal. You know, the word that I always say to my girl is like, speak up. When you have an idea, when you have something in mind, don't be shy. Get there and say what you need to say. And I think this is a rule of thumb. It seems like good common sense. It is such a powerful thing. You know, don't keep your voice low. Just say it.
I just want to add one thing about this, and I know that our name is taking the lead for inclusion, so I apologize for this. But I think we need to eliminate the word inclusion from the whole discussion, because inclusion implies that there's a sort of default setting at the center that needs to pull from the outside, and that's not how humanity works. That's not how everything that matters works. We are already in. You know, one of the reasons medical science was so ineffective in handling heart attacks among women is that they had been for years studying men. And it never crossed their mind that women are not just men who have babies. In the U.S. Constitution, I mean, we are getting ready any day now in the United States. It's going to happen. It's just a question of when. We're going to lose our right to reproductive freedom. And one of the reasons that's going to happen that nobody will talk about is because the Constitution was written by men who thought women were men who had babies, or maybe they were just invisible and irrelevant. But nevertheless, if they had continued their discourse about personal freedom, which is the heart and soul of the American Constitution, if they had continued that discourse as though women mattered, we wouldn't be having this problem. It would be in the Constitution. There is no place in the Constitution for bodily integrity. There's no place in the Constitution for the reality of violence against women. If those things had been understood to be real things that affected people that mattered, then we would have an entirely different discourse right now. So inclusion needs to go away, and we need to start thinking of it as people need to take their rightful places.
Agnès, I think you wanted to jump in.
Yes, I would like to bounce back on two things. First of all, the question of what kind of world we are building is really at stake now. Have in mind that 90% of the algorithms that are now shaping the world of tomorrow are coded by men. So what we have faced earlier as a world which was not really adapted to women, that is, the normal person is not 1.75 m and don't weigh 75 kilograms. And just look at the, you know, all the products that are manufactured, and you will see that most of the time it is adapted to that kind of person. So what we are building now through artificial intelligence is a world shaped by men, and it will be much more difficult to point out what are the consequences of this. So we really need to absolutely accelerate on putting girls and women in technology, in coding, etc. This is the first point. Second point, I really agree with what you said around inclusiveness. Inclusiveness is not to say to the vulnerable person, hey, come with us. It's to say that there is diversity, and it is shown in many academics, is a factor of performance in economy. You mentioned the figure for women, but you mentioned handicapped people or whatever, fat people anyway, and clearly diversity is a factor of performance, because the more talents you will have and the more talents you make visible, then the most potential you will have in your economy, in ideas, and in different points of view. The people that are just shaped the same way, they think the same way, and they don't anticipate the same risks. So I truly believe that as a part of the Ministry of Economy, it's not only a question of fairness, of moral or whatever. It's a question of performance and of a better world with more anticipation of the risks and more sustainable growth that we have to deliver.
Mm-hmm. Alessandra, you wanted to come back.
I'm spot on with you, Agnès, on this, because one of the issues that we see, it's the way in which banks are going to measure credit risk. And so, which is important because it makes, the whole difference about who's going to get the money and who's not going to get the money. The use of algorithm is so precise and allows, and we've seen this happen in the United States right now, it allows banks to really tailor which groups are going to be, more risky from the point of view of banks who are giving credit. And they're targeting specific groups made on, origins or positions in the market, also geographically distributed. So this is so important. And what Agnès just said, it is algorithms are made mainly by coding, men, and not by women. So we need to push, young women to go into STEM studies, into becoming more aware of these issues and getting jobs in the industry that then leads to creation of algorithm, use of artificial intelligence in the financial world. This is a very important issue. And also, I like to add, the big data companies, the whole huge platform industry that can provide services, social means, and credit facilities through networks, they are empowered with an amount of data that no other industry has ever had. Now, that is also crucial, because if we do not understand how to regulate that, how to make sure that there's a level playing field for everybody to step in, and how to understand who's making those algorithms that go out to each single person, all of us. Now, that's going to be an amazing threat to people. It's going to polarize people. It's going to create new poors, and it's going to expose people who do not have, and I come back to the first thing, financial education, to an amount of risks which are not even able to understand right now. And I think, Anne, you see that in your industry.
No, completely. And I do. I mean, even up in Sweden, we've seen these algorithms actually giving less loans to women. It's outrageous, really. And I feel very strongly about this. I'm an engineer and a mathematician, and I used to be able to code. Used to. And there are so few women still graduating in STEM subjects. And this is where I think, again, industry has to step up and work with government to change this. We have programs we're rolling out around the world and reached 400,000 girls so far. And the girls we're talking to, we're not talking to 18-year-olds, we're talking to 10-year-olds. 10 to 12, because that's the age that the girls start thinking, this is who I can be. And I was just laughing and saying to Abigail that when I was 12, the first man landed on the moon, and I stood and looked at the moon and said, I want to be an astronaut. Now, I never became an astronaut, sadly, although, maybe I could go to the moon these days if I save up enough. But I think, you have to inspire girls to want to do this. Otherwise, we're going to live in a world that continues to be designed by men, where the average height is 1.75 meters, and it's and the other thing, by the way, I've just come from Iceland, and there was a talk about the capital that wasn't going to women entrepreneurs, and one of the speakers there, Jo, who's on the 30% club with me, said, she said, sometimes you're pitching and the men don't even understand the product. And she said, I saw a woman entrepreneur pitching something that helped pelvic floors to 3 guys who were over 50. And they all sat there and went, we don't know what this product is.
I know we are about to run out of time, and I know we wanted to pivot to concrete answers. So I don't want to leave until we do that. Is that all right?
I think so. I think what we need to do, we've talked a lot about what's not working. I would like to leave you guys, from this panel at least, with what we think has actually changed for the better in the past year, or that you are absolutely convinced is going to be better in 2020 by the time we get back here?
Here's my concrete advice. I know we have to go fast. Make it your habit in life to walk into every room you walk into. Don't ever do this. I mean, walk into a room without doing this. And count the number of people who are not there. Not just women, not just women. We need to do this for people of color, for immigrants, for people with disabilities, and so forth. Pay attention if you're on a panel or in a room of power to who is not present.
Really quickly, we are out of time, but a couple of words each. I'm sure we'll be allowed. Very quick.
So I'm in a lucky position of being vice chair of a big technology company, financial tech company that can change people's lives. And I am really committed to reaching out to tens of millions of female entrepreneurs and getting them the money that they need to be effective in the economy. I'm starting to work with all of the people in my company and all of our customers to do that now. And I'm fairly positive we'll have a massive impact next year.
Agnès?
Well, you know that we are pushing a G7 agenda on women, and that each G7 country committed to pass a bill next year with at least one best practice measure for women empowerment next year. And we will do our part of the job. We will pass a bill. And this is a call for action for everybody, because we need to have some recommendations and some support, because I can tell you that we are now trying to push some ideas on the table, and resistance is still there. And so I'm sure that it will help the cause, but we need that everybody feel responsible for that and feel that each time they say no to a woman, or each time a woman don't step up, don't speak up, and don't take her risk, then she's playing against the cause.
Let me say, as in the Star Wars film, resistance is futile. But Alessandra, last word to you as you start.
Younger women, study, study, study. Older women, you speak up. You exercise your power, the power you have in your hand, and teach the young ones how to do it. And men, please walk with us. Be together.
Thank you. I'm so sorry. We have no time for questions. Would you thank the audience, please, for their help and their contribution? And if you could thank the panelists.